Okay, I'd like to introduce Professor Jim Orford, who you can see. Jim is a leading addictions researcher, author and campaigner. One of his special areas of interest has been the impact of addiction problems on families and other close others, and the development of methods for helping and supporting affected family members. He co-founded the Addiction and the Family International Network, known as AFINET, which has been working internationally with academics, policymakers and practitioners to promote the well-being of close others and developing research, policy and practice. He speaks regularly in the media about the need for gambling reform and has given evidence to several parliamentary groups and select committees. He's published over 13 books and innumerable articles, and we were delighted that he agreed to be our speaker for our first webinar this morning. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jim, and I'm really looking forward to what he has to share with us. Thank you, Jim.
Right, thank you very much, Alison. Hear me all right? Sound is okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the delight is absolutely shared. I mean, I'm delighted to be here this morning. been very impressed over a number of years with the work that Quad has been doing, and I've had a number of very enjoyable and stimulating interactions over a number of years with Alison and with her predecessor, Helena. Actually, you mentioned, Alison, you mentioned select committees and so on. I think my first meeting with Helena, one of my very first meetings with Helena was when we jointly were on a panel giving evidence to a select committee about gambling. And believe me, there's nothing more bonding than being, than facing a select committee together. So I'm quite delighted to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Addiction is the topic. We've got quite a bit of time, which is good, but it's a huge topic, addiction. So I can only cover a small amount of it. So let's get on. Let's get straight on with it. The first half, as Alison said, is really raising questions about what is addiction. What do we make of it? How can we understand it? Because on the face of it, it's a very strange thing that people find themselves in a position where they're struggling to control or to stop a form of behavior which they know at some level is not constructive for them. It's become destructive, and yet it's very difficult to stop. So how on earth can one explain this anomaly? And it's such a common thing. So it's a common human anomaly to be doing this. I think Aristotle had a word for it. He called it acrasia. This idea that very often we know that something we're doing is not in our best interests. We probably shouldn't be doing it, and yet we find ourselves continuing to do it. So this is what it is. The understanding I've come to over the years about it is that essentially what it is a habit. It's if you think it's a disorder or a problem, it's a habit disorder. William James, brother of Henry James. So William James is often thought of as one of the fathers of psychology. He thought habit was extremely important to us. He thought that early in life, developing good, constructive habits was so important to human development, and that if we find ourselves developing some destructive habits, things that are not good for us, then that's extremely bad luck to develop those habits early in life. And the interesting thing was that he thought of habit as something that was both free will you do have control over your habits. But on the other hand, it's something that becomes automatic. So it actually combines those two things. It combines something that's automatic and yet something that is still under one's will or one's control. So I think people often talk about, developing a bad habit, my drug habit, people often refer to. So I think the word habit takes us some way. Um, Actually, I've got a nice quote here from somebody called Mark Lewis. Mark Lewis is a neuroscientist who's written a bit about addiction, not only from his professional point of view, but also from his personal point of view, because he describes himself as having been a drug addict through most of my 20s, he says. And what he says about addiction is that it's a habit that has become entrenched, a nasty, often relentless habit, a serious habit, a frightful, devastating, and insidious process of change in our habits. So, although people might say, oh, surely addiction is more than just a habit, the point is that addictions can become, or habits, all habits can become extremely powerful if they're not controlled. And Mark Lewis, I think, is understanding from both perspectives, professional and personal, and understands how devastating and difficult to control a habit can become. So how do we develop habits? Well, there are lots of elements to this, but one of them is conditioning. Let's call it conditioning. Um, all the things that become addictive, alcohol, uh, drugs, gambling. I think those are some of the big ones that we're concerned about. Tobacco obviously is another, and there are other addictions which I might mention later on. The question of how far can one extend the concept of addiction, I think, is an interesting one. But all of those things have the capacity to be what behavioral psychologists would call rewarding. They're all things that can do good things for our mood, or our state of mind, if you like. Some of them are painkillers. Um, in fact, one of the, as most of you will know, I'm sure, one of the main forms of addiction, which has been giving problem, particularly in the USA, in recent years, has been addiction to prescribed opiates or prescribed painkillers of various sorts. So controlling pain is one way in which certain drugs can be very rewarding. Um, but things can be rewarding because they can be very exciting. People would often talk about, in the early days of taking heroin, for example, it giving you a kick or it giving you a buzz. So actually lifting one's emotion temporarily, at least. And if you watch a film of a race course, a horse race course, and the camera zooms in upon people getting excited towards the end of the race, you can see just what powerful effect gambling on a horse race is having to people's mood. The mood goes up, and of course then it goes down if you lose. So there's a big change in mood. But all these things can do things that in the first instance are very rewarding to people. They may cease to be rewarding eventually, but at least in the early stages of developing habit, things can be very rewarding. There's all the condition that goes on around it. I mean, everything. If you're interested in horse racing, all the things to do with horses, all the things to do with a racetrack, all the things to do with the betting paraphernalia. If one is addicted to drugs, then the paraphernalia to do with taking drugs. People who smoke will talk about, the importance of just the feel of holding a cigarette. People who are addicted to gambling in amusement arcades will talk about the excitement of approaching a particular amusement arcade, the colors or the logo of the company that they particularly bet with. Or Dostoevsky who wrote The Gambler and had a gambling problem himself, talked about getting extremely excited when he just heard the clink um, of money around a casino table. So all these cues. This is sort of stimulus conditioning, behavioral psychologists would call it. And then there's the cognitive side of it as well. There's the fact that when you develop a habit, things, you start to develop all sorts of ideas about it, and some of that is just knowledge about the activity, um, knowledge about how to do it, where to find it. Um, I mean, I've fortunately never taken cocaine. I wouldn't know where to find it. I just wouldn't know the way there. And if I did find it, I wouldn't know quite what to do with it. I mean, there's all sorts of knowledge about the habits that one develops. And there's also attention. There's lots of experiments have shown that one's attention changes when you are particularly interested in something, you've developed a habit towards something, you become addicted to something particularly, then you have differential attention. You're more likely to attend to signs, even words, experiments where people are given words and they see how much attention people are paying, how quickly they respond to particular words. People who are addicted to things are much quicker to attend to things that are related to their particular habit. And then there's the social side, the huge social side of things. People develop habits because other people that you know and mix with, and people you admire and people you follow, particularly your family, of course, and your friendship group as an adolescent, and your people you know as you go through life. What they are doing is of enormous influence upon oneself. So habit has all these sides to it. It has a behavioral side to it. It has a mental cognitive side to it. It has an emotional side to it. It has a social side to it. For those who don't particularly like the expression habit and think that doesn't quite do justice to addiction, the word I've used often in the past is the word attachment. That I see addiction as, if you like, an excessive attachment, a very strong, powerful attachment to something. So if you're addicted to alcohol, in this way of thinking, you have formed a very powerful attachment to alcohol, perhaps particularly to your favorite form of alcohol. Um, it's interesting. Some people refer, in the context of families, some people have referred to being attached to an addictive object, gambling it might be, or it might be drugs, it might be alcohol, it might be tobacco, whatever it is rather like a marriage, or in the context of family life, if you like, an illicit relationship. And that's one of the reasons why family members find it so difficult to deal with someone in the family who's seriously addicted to something, because it's almost as if that person is being unfaithful. It's almost as if that person has got something else going on the side, because it's absorbing so much of one's behavior, so much of one's time, maybe one's money, certainly one's attention. So that's kind of how I tend to see things. I tend to see things as habits, serious and nasty. They can become habits, or forms of attachment, if you like. One of the consequences, I think, of that is that because it's such a complicated thing, it's got all these different sides to it: social side, a behavioral side, a mental side, and so on. Is that there are many ways into addiction. And one of the things I learned, I think, early on in studying addiction, is that there's no simple answer to the question of what causes addiction. So I always say, if anyone tells you that the cause of addiction is a particular addictive type of personality, or anybody tells you that everybody is addicted, has experienced trauma in childhood, or somebody tells you that addiction is due to social inequality. I mean, we'll come back to social inequality because it is a factor. But anybody who tells you that is the secret, that is the answer to why addictive habits develop, I would say no, it isn't. There are many, many factors involved, and it differs for different people. So for some people, the social side is going to be much the most important. So if you find yourselves with a group of friends in adolescence who are engaging in a particular form of behavior, which leads to a particular habit, then the social side is particularly important. The peer group is particularly important. But equally, there's no question but that various traumatic experiences and difficulties in childhood do make people vulnerable towards addictions later on. So there are all sorts of genetic factors will come into it as well as they do to almost all behaviors. So there are many ways in to addiction. I think that's quite an important lesson. Then there's another question that arises out of this: is to what extent can addiction be thought of as a disorder, a disease, an illness of some sort? Because there's no question that addiction is something that comes up often very slowly on people. It can start off with something that is rewarding, something that relieves your pain, something that gives you a lift, does something good to your mental state that you like. But over time, things deepen and things become more difficult, and it may become a mixed blessing. We'll come on to that again in a minute. So there is a continuum in people's lives. I mean, it doesn't always start off that way. People who've got addictions don't start off when they start drinking or they start taking drugs, they don't start off with an addiction. It develops. And sometimes over many years, it takes develop. So there is a continuum in people's lives. And isn't there also a continuum in the population? And from a public health point of view, there's no doubt also, but that there is a continuum. So for everyone who has a very, very serious addiction, which requires treatment of some sort, there are goodness knows how many. There may be 10 or more other people who are somewhere on the spectrum. So thinking of addiction as a dimension or a spectrum. So how does that fit with the idea of addiction being a serious illness-like condition? How can one reconcile those two things? It's a continuum, and there's no sharp cut-off between those who are addicted and those who are not. It's a gradual continuum. How can one reconcile that with the fact that we do see addiction as something that becomes a very, very serious illness? And I think the answer to that lies in the fact that habits at some point along the way take off. They take off. We're quite used, I think, now with viruses and so on. Everyone's quite used now to the idea of exponential curves. That things, it's not just that things gradually go up, but they can take off. So the infection rate can take off. And I think that happens to people when they become addicted. Various things can happen. You can think of it, if you like, as vicious circles. Things begin to escalate. And I'm just looking at something I've got here in front of me. There are various ways, I think, in which things escalate. One is that, people who've had addictions will know this very well. And Alcoholics Anonymous, I think, has this lovely expression, stinking thinking. That when people are talking about their own addictions and when they should give up, and maybe they won't give up, and maybe they'll give up next year or tomorrow, there's all sorts of stinking thinking that goes on. And this happens when an addiction reaches the point, or a nasty habit of this kind reaches the point where people are beginning to realize but it's not doing what it used to do. It's now a mixed blessing. It's no longer something that one can just take it or leave it. It's become difficult. Then people's thinking changes, and people with addictions will always say afterwards, people will always tell you, people have told me this over the years, that their thinking becomes almost warped in a way. You're beginning to recognize that this habit is a bad one for you, but you don't recognize that all the time. And in times of temptation, that thinking slips away. When you're away from temptation, yes, you can think that when you're talking to your doctor, or you can say that. But when you're talking with your mates in the pub, you think differently. Things can become quite secretive, and people often will say they start to avoid telling people the complete truth about what they're drinking or their drug taking. Or gambling is a terrible example. I mean, because it's possible to keep gambling secret in a way that a little bit more difficult to keep drinking secret from your family and friends and so on. But family members will sometimes say, but I hadn't realized he was gambling or she was gambling until the point came where it all came out, and I realized that actually we hadn't got the family savings that I thought we had. Or I've suddenly discovered that our home had been remortgaged when I thought our mortgage was paid off. So I mean, that's extreme examples of secrecy, but I think the idea of beginning to keep things secret, starting to be devious about it. There can be changes, of course, in social life. So when things reach a really, really serious point, and people maybe start to lose a job, or they start to lose some friends, they may start to mix with other people, or life changes, and so there's a social change, a life change, which also has a vicious circle about it. And all these things sort of increase things start to go up. They start to go up exponentially. So where there's been a gradual increase in the infection, the infection suddenly takes off. And the other thing, I think, of course, is the effect on people's mental health. So it's you could call this demoralization as a general word, that it is to have this nasty entrenched habit, as Mark Lewis calls it, is very demoralizing. It's very depressing not to be able, and to find that actually you want to control something and you're finding it very, very difficult to control. It becomes a struggle. This is very demoralizing, can be very depressing indeed. So it's not just a nasty habit, but it seriously affects people's mental health in more general ways as well. The silver lining, of course, is that one of the things that happens in the process is that we start to think about changing our habits. Most of our habits that we acquired in life, we don't think about changing. I mean, I don't think about changing my coffee intake, because although I may be mildly dependent on it and would miss it, and I look forward to my morning coffee like so many people. So there's a mild dependence there, but it's not. Fortunately for me, that's not reached the point where I really feel it's damaging my health, or it's seriously affecting my family life, or it's affecting my ability to work. So it's not something that I'm thinking of changing particularly, and I just hope my supply of coffee continues. But the thing about habits that become really nasty and become addictive is that they then are the seeds of change, because one of the things that changes for you is beginning to think, yeah, maybe I should be changing this. How can I change? So there is a silver lining to that. Let me see, how are we doing time wise? I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. So I won't go on too much longer with the first half. Oh, I suppose one of the things, yes, one of the things that I could just say is, is addiction a brain disease? I mean, this has come up recently because there is a body of opinion, particularly in the United States, that is arguing that addiction is a brain disease. And there's a body in this country led by a colleague of mine who I've known for many years, a psychologist in Northumbria, um, who's been leading a group who are challenging this idea of addiction as a brain disease. If by a brain disease, what you mean is this is probably something that's been wrong with people's brains, from very early on. It's something that probably predates their addiction. It may be genetic. It's a major causative factor, and what's more, the major way of treating it is drugs that affect the brain. Then I would absolutely go along with Nick Heather, my colleague, who says absolutely no way is addiction a brain disease. But if on the other hand you say, well, there's nothing going on in the brain, we can forget the brain. Well, of course you can't. I mean, with all behavior, you can't you can't neglect the brain altogether. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but there's been a lot of interesting neuroscientific work and theory development about addiction in recent years. And it seems that one of the areas that's particularly involved in addiction, when habit, and I would say this is a consequence largely rather than a cause. One of the things that develops as part of addictive habits developing, is something happens to what some are calling the motivational core in the brain. This is the part of the brain sort of deep inside, lower part of the brain. It's often called the limbic system, or the midbrain area. It's old in evolutionary terms. It's an old part of the brain. And the feeling that it used to be called the reward center. People thought it was particularly involved when people experienced anything that was particularly rewarding. But people now think it's much more generally a motivational center, where any people may have come across this idea of thinking fast and thinking slow, which has been a very popular idea in psychology, and I think has caught on. But not just thinking, but also feeling. So when you feel and instinctively, and you feel fast and quick. So, for example, if something makes you angry, and you immediately have a feeling of anger, or you immediately have a feeling of wanting to withdraw from something, or you immediately have a feeling that you want to be angry with someone back for something they've done, or you immediately want to fly from something. But you don't necessarily understand why. You don't think it out. You don't. It's a quick automatic thing. Um, those thoughts and those feelings and those responses are probably to a large extent under the control of this area in the limbic system, particularly a part called the striatum. But one doesn't need to know exactly what it's called. And then the thing about that is that one of the ideas, and it's a common idea, I think, probably in philosophy going back centuries, the idea that there's a conflict between our impulsive way of reacting and our more thoughtful way of reacting. So the notion is that addiction becomes, as time goes on, much more under the control of what's going on low down in the brain centrally. And in order to get control, one's got to re-establish control with the frontal lobes, the bit up here, which is evolutionarily much newer, and which requires more reflective thought about behavior. So I'm not going to talk much about treatment, for addiction or how to overcome addictions, but in discussion we could certainly talk about that if you wish. But when people say to me, what is the treatment for addiction, I could say, well, there are lots of treatments for addiction. It really is, the picture is very, very varied. So just as there are lots of ways into addiction, there are also lots of ways out of addiction. But I think if there's anything in common with the different ways out of addiction, the different methods of overcoming addiction, treatment for addiction, it is that they all involve re-establishing some reflective thinking, some frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is often called the executive. So it's because addiction has become such an automatic, quick, impulsive thing, over which one finds oneself struggling to control. It's the re-establishing control by reflective thinking, and that can sometimes be done with a therapist. It can sometimes be done on your own. It can sometimes be done with a friend. It can sometimes be done at Gamblers Anonymous, Alcoholics Anonymous. It can be done. It can be done in all sorts of different ways. It can be done by slowly coming to a realization of how things are. I mean, people will often say, "Well, I didn't actually go to a therapist. I didn't see a therapist, and it took me a long time to see what was really going on, and various things happened in my life, and I eventually came to my senses about this." So there's all sorts of different ways of change happening, but I think they all have in common this, slowing one's thinking, slow thinking rather than this quick, impulsive sort of central midbrain sort of primitive thinking over addiction. I think Alison, I think I've probably said enough, probably said more than enough. I could go on. As you can tell, this is a subject I'm very interested in, have worked on sort of most of my career. So I could go on, but I think I've probably said quite enough for a first half, haven't I?
Jim, thank you very much indeed. You've covered a huge amount of ground in that first half, and I'm sure that everyone listening was really grateful to you for covering such a complex issue in a way that was there was a great amount of insight into the variety of factors that contribute to addiction and the various ways that it's been described. I confess, a little taken aback when you began by describing it as a habit. I've always fought hard against that, and I assume that something that's a habit is something that you can set a New Year's resolution for and deal with in a couple of weeks or so. But I think what really came to my mind as you continued to speak was this concept of it being a spectrum, and that people can be found at any point along that spectrum, and things grow incrementally over a long period. And I've certainly known people, and I'm sure people who are viewing this morning will have known, or perhaps part of their own experience, that things can begin in a low level way and then escalate and get triggered often by critical life events, for example, like divorce or bereavement, which can tip people into something much more serious. I'd like to invite participants, as you're listening to us start off this Q&A. We've got about 20 minutes before we take a break. So if you would like to ask Jim a question, then do use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen and type your questions in. I've got an initial question for you, Jim, which is, given that you've described a spectrum and you've touched at the end there on treatment, I wonder if you see this spectrum as being something that people can move up, but also move back down. And is it possible to reach full recovery? Because people talk about being in recovery, but we'll also talk about it being just one day at a time. And I talk to people who say it's not possible to recover, that once you're an alcoholic or a gambling addict, that's with you for life, and your life's work is about tackling that one day at a time. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, I think I have a view. It's a complicated question you ask, Alison,
Sorry.
there's been lots of research on it and lots of theorizing and thinking about it and so on. Um, there, I think my view is that because there is this spectrum, of course, people who are fairly low on the spectrum, of course, um, people can make changes. They can even make New Year's resolutions, but I think people can only do that if they're, if they are fairly low on the spectrum. And I think when people move up the spectrum, um, then I think progressively it gets to the point where people have got to take more dramatic steps. You can think about it and you can begin to come to a different realization, but people have got to take much more serious steps. So the further up the spectrum people are, I think the more likely it is that really you need to be talking to someone independent about it. You really do need to have a therapist, or you really do need to be engaged with other people. You really do need to go to a self-help group. You probably can't be doing it on your own. And also the easier solution becomes the more dramatic solution. So it is, many people will say, if you really want to give up drinking, the easiest thing is just to give it up. It's at the end of the day, difficult though it may be, it's going to be much easier just to say, I've become a non-drinker, or I've become a non-gambler. And if you try and go to the pub and say, I'm going to try and control it, well, yes, some people will gain control, but the further up the spectrum you are, the less likely that is to be the case. I used to have somebody from the USA who was very good on addiction and sort of behavioral side of addictions and so on, and cognitive behavior therapy for addiction and so on was one of his things. And he used to, in his talks, he used to put up a slide which was a cartoon, and it was two women outside a cake shop. And I have to say, it sounds a bit sort of not gender neutral, but they were quite large. You could see that they enjoyed a lot of cakes. And one of the ladies said to the other, let's go in and see what happens. So so the and this was his illustration of, if you're going to do something serious about your overeating, with the same for drinking, same with drugs, whatever it is, don't put it to chance. Don't test yourself out by putting yourself in the most difficult situation. Make sure that you stay away from temptation. Make sure you don't have a packet of biscuits, lying around. Or so I think it depends where you are on the continuum, really.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. We've got some questions here from our participants. So Kate Sanderson, she's asked, do you think drug education is helpful for preventing negative drug life experience?
Right, thank you, Kate. This is, yes, drug education. If you mean by that sort of education in schools, for example, or education for young people about the dangers of drugs, or trying to deal with drugs, that's quite a difficult one, because I'm not an expert in this area, so bear that in mind. But I do know that from a public health point of view, education is generally considered to be one of the weaker forms of prevention. Um, that, and it can even rebound. I mean, if you start to talk to young people about the dangers of something, is that going to be effective? Is there a real danger that you start to give people information that they wouldn't otherwise have had, or you raise the question of whether this might be an exciting thing to do, or if you particularly fancy yourself as someone who's a bit of a rebel, maybe here's an opportunity to be rebellious now, if this is what the adults are telling you. So there have been studies where educational approaches have actually rebounded and not been affected. So I think you have to be very careful. It depends what the education is, how it's done, and really one needs to evaluate it and follow it up carefully. But it is besides things that actually alter the supply of whatever it is that is addictive, educating people about it doesn't have a terribly good reputation amongst in the public health area. Actually, it's not considered to be one of the strongest forms of prevention.
Interesting. Thank you, Jim. Another question here from John Lyon, who's one of our trustees. When speaking to power, what difficulties have you experienced in presenting your understanding of addiction?
Right, John. Thank you. This is, I mean, I may be coming on to more of this in the second half, because I want to. If the first half was more about sort of personal side, the second half is probably more about the political side. So we may come on to that. But the kind of ideas I've been talking about so far. Difficulties. Well, when I first wrote about the ideas, the idea that gambling could be addictive was scarcely accepted, and it's now much better accepted than it was. And quad, although quad is called Action on Alcohol and Drugs, as you can see, it's about drugs, alcohol, and gambling. And I think now it's pretty much well established. I mean, there's still some people who are holding out against the idea that anything other than a substance can be addiction. But I think it's now much better accepted that something like gambling can be addictive. And that raises the whole question, doesn't it, of how broad, how wide can you go with the concept? I've mentioned eating, so the idea that some forms of eating can be addictive, like binge eating disorder, for example, can be addictive. Like, although strangely enough, eating disorders tends to be something that clinically, in terms of mental health, so it's treated completely separately from addictions. They don't, it isn't part of addiction for some reason or other. But I've argued long ago that it was. Gaming addiction is now a big one. The World Health Organization have recognized that. So video games, and particularly, of course, dangerous for young people. So that's part of why that's so important. So you can extend it further. But so my idea, which I developed, I wrote a book. One of the best things I think I've done in my career, probably looking back, it was write a book called Excessive Appetites back, and the first edition came out in the mid 1980s. So it's quite some time ago now. And that was trying to say, look, we're talking about things that are attachments that form to all sorts of things, not just substances. And I think over the years that idea, I think, has been reasonably well accepted. I don't think the idea of habit. It's interesting, Alison, your initial response was, surely it's not a habit. But so I don't think the idea of it being a habit is so well accepted. And I'm not quite sure I understand why, really. In terms of the kind of things I've been talking about, it seems to me it should be seen as a habit.
Okay. Slightly longer question here. This is from Nigel Dower. Aristotle's idea of hexis is often translated habit, but it can be translated disposition. The philosopher A.G.P. Kenny once said that a disposition is something which makes things easier to do, and habit make things difficult not to do. Maybe an addiction is something it is very difficult not to follow, and maybe for some impossible not to do.
Right, Nigel, thank you. A bit more philosophy there. Fine, right. I was quickly out of my depth with philosophy. I can see that. But yes, that's very interesting. Yes, I like the idea that habit's something that makes it difficult for you not to do. People will often talk about addiction as something that becomes automatic. So some of as habits, addictive type habits develop, several things happen. I mean, one is that people start to do more of it. So it starts to consume more time and possibly more money. And another thing is it becomes more generalized. So people who've talked about young people developing a tobacco smoking habit for the first time, when it starts, people are usually taking the odd cigarette at the weekend, or usually in a social situation with friends. Over the course of with tobacco, over usually a relatively short period of time, over a period of maybe for many people a year or two, it has become a habit that is no longer linked to social events. It generalized across the day. So people find them starting to use cigarettes early in the day. So it's become something to generalize. It's no longer discriminatory, which is another useful idea. I think that most of our habits are discriminatory. We discriminate about them. We decide, yeah, I'll only do it. I'll only drink after the sun goes down, after below the yard arm, in early evening, or I'll only have, I'll delay my second coffee of the day until 11 o'clock or something like that. So those discriminations start to go. And the other thing is the automatic nature of it, that things increasingly become automatic. And good habits, of course, become automatic. You brush my teeth before going to bed without thinking about it. In fact, if I didn't do it, I think, what's wrong? God, I haven't cleaned my teeth. So good habits become automatic as well. Riding a bicycle, I couldn't get on a bicycle and not know how to ride it now. But for somebody who's never ridden a bicycle, it's extremely difficult. So things become automatic. So I like that idea. Thank you, Nigel, for that idea of it being something you can no longer not do.
Okay. Another question here, Jim. This is from Rachel Berger. Can you say something on genetics and addiction? Can a tendency be inherited?
Okay. Another area where I'm likely to be out of my depth sort of very quickly, because I'm not a geneticist. But I suppose generally what I would say about genetics, and it's not just me saying this, it's lots of people would say this, is because addiction is complicated, because there's so many facets to it, the social facet, the behavioral facet, and so on, and because it can develop over time, and because there are lots of different forms of addiction. You think how different tobacco smoking is from using heroin, or from gambling on a horse race or on a fruit machine, or going to a casino. I mean, these things are so different. Because of all those factors, it's extremely unlikely that there would be any simple genetic mechanism. There was the nearest that came to it, I think, in the case of alcohol. I think there is some genetic thing that protects people from alcohol problems, because it's a flushing response. And I think people in the Far East, for some reason or other, are particularly likely to have this. So there's a very specific thing that might actually affect your propensity to develop an alcohol problem. It might protect you, it might be a barrier to developing alcohol problems. But so genetics is bound to come into it. I mean, genetics comes into all behavior. There's nothing about human behavior where genetics is not involved in some way or other. So of course genetics is important, but the likelihood that it'll be a simple genetic predisposition is extremely unlikely. You might have a genetic predisposition to be, I don't know, a personality who is particularly sociable, let's say. There might be some genetic influence on extroversion. And it might be that being an extrovert as a young person, particularly if your social group is into something that is going to put them at risk of developing an addictive habit, it may be that your genetic predisposition to extroversion, and of course it's not just genetics that influences extroversion, but it might be that gives you a bit of a a bit of a lift towards developing some sort of addiction, but it's going to be very complicated. It's not going to be simple.
Yeah. Which is a message that's coming across from all that you've spoken about so far, Jim, isn't it? That it's multifactional. And if it was that simple, then we would have been able to help so many more people already. I've got a question here. The questioner has asked to remain anonymous. Of course, we respect that. What is a reasonable or normal path for family which has an addict within it who is near the end, death by overdose or death killing by driving under influence? The advice is to withdraw. That's hard to do.
Yes, actually, I was going to come on to families later afterwards. So it's a very good question, and I certainly will answer that. I mean, basically, just to anticipate one of the things I was going to say later was part of our model that my group and the people I've worked with have developed about how addiction affects the family is that a central idea is the idea of coping. How as a family do you cope with the fact that you've someone very dear to you, someone very close to you has got a serious addiction problem, and that's affecting them, and it's affecting you, and it's affecting the rest of the family. How do you cope with that? And certainly one of the ways of coping, and it's only one, is the idea of withdrawing. But that can cover a whole multitude of things. I mean, it could cover deciding that really you've absolutely had enough. So if your partner, your wife, your husband has got a serious addiction problems going on for a long time, you think you've tried your best to do something about it. Withdrawing might mean just leaving. It just might mean you've had enough, maybe totally or temporarily. You've had enough. You want to distance. But it just might mean emotionally withdrawing. And I think when people talk about withdrawing as a recommended thing for family members, they're usually talking about emotional withdrawing a bit, because inevitably one of the things that happens to you as an affected family member is that you get drawn in and you get terribly involved, and you get involved both because it's really upsetting and really stressful to you, but you want to do your best for the person, you want to help the person, you want to be engaged in helping them. So you recommend things, you try things, and of course you get involved in difficult conversations about, were you out gambling? Did you, have you been taking drugs? Are you really clean after all? Or did you go to your treatment appointment and you're not sure, and you kind of suspect that, your family member is perhaps not telling you the whole truth about it, and so you get, in all sorts of ways, family members get thoroughly involved. Why wouldn't they? Why couldn't they? We all would. We all do. So that recommendation to withdraw a bit, but obviously there are loads of different ways of doing that, and that's where family members often need help themselves. I mean, how do I withdraw? What do you mean? What do you mean by withdraw? How on earth I'm married to this person? This person's my son, my daughter. What do you mean? How can I withdraw from this person? So people need a lot of counselling, a lot of advice, a lot of help often, which often they don't get, of course.
Of course, and I've heard that concept be described as detachment.
Yes, that's
12-step Al-Anon, for example. They talk about detachment with love.
Yeah.
And that's what you're referring to. Yeah. Just keeping an eye on the time. We've got 5 minutes left before the break. There's a different kind of question here from Yasmin Johnson. Is the problem of addiction made more of a problem by practices designed to secure profits in the sale of goods? So, for example, increased levels of sugar in food, making available single cigarettes to children, something tobacco companies have done in African countries, etc.
Yeah, good question. The answer is yes, yes, and yes, and yes. And again, this was going to be something I was going to address more in the second half. So we will come to that. But it's a very good question, and the answer is definitely yes. gambling is something I mentioned it several times already, and it's something I've got particularly involved in lately, because there's quite a lot going on in terms of gambling. It's a rather fluid political situation, gambling at the moment, in a way that maybe alcohol, isn't such a fluid thing. And there's the government has got a review of the gambling legislation going on right now. And I'm sure Alison's nodding. Alison will be, I'm sure, or if she's not already, she will be doing hard work, because I know Quad does do very, very hard work on these things. You'll be doing hard work on making a submission on behalf of Quad to about this, and I will be too. But yes, absolutely is the answer. And the food one is a very interesting case, I think, because there's been a lot of publicity about it, hasn't there, about the sugar and the fast food industry and the games they play to sell their products, and the resistance they put up to actually having legislation put in the way of harming people. So that's a really good lesson, I think, for the alcohol, to learn about what's the alcohol industry doing, what's the gambling industry doing, what, dare I say, what would companies be doing if they were able legally to sell drugs that are illicit at the moment. Another topic we might come on to in the second half.
We've got some evidence emerging from states in the US, for example, where that's been the case. But as you say, perhaps we can come on to those sorts of questions after the break, and after you've given the second half of your talk, Jim. I'm going to, rather than start off any more questions now, I think we're just coming up to 12:30. So if it's okay for you and everyone, we're going to take a short comfort break. Time to make yourself some more coffee if that's your habit. I certainly will. I'll put a few slides up giving some information about Quad in the intermission, and we'll come back at 20 to 12. Thank you very much indeed for the first half of your talk and for the responses to the questions, Jim. That's been really useful.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. Jim, if you can unmute if you haven't done already.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted.
Lovely. Okay, well, I hope everyone's had a good break and feel replenished. I'm sure we're really looking forward to the second half of your talk, Jim. So I'll leave you to take it from there.
Okay, thank you very much. Enjoyed your questions very much at the first half there. So I hope we'll leave plenty of time for more questions in this half as well. As I said, the second half is, if you think of things as the personal and the political, the first half is perhaps the more personal stuff, and the second half perhaps the more political stuff. So broadening out the idea beyond a focus on individual people, their individual attachments, their individual habits, if that's what we want to call it, their individual addictions. The first way in which I wanted to broaden it out, and we've had an opportunity to do a little bit of this already, was about families, and the idea that actually addiction, if addiction is disempowering, I mean, that's another word that I think is very useful in terms of addiction. That if you have an addiction, you do feel disempowered. Your ability to conduct your life in a unified way in accordance with your main life goals, whatever they are, to do with work, to do with education, to do with family, to do with creative interests, to do with hobbies, entertainment, whatever it is, your ability to pursue that life in an integrated way is interfered with by having an addiction. So it's a disempowering experience. But the disempowerment that addiction does goes well beyond the individual person who is the focus of addiction, and in particular families. It's not just families, but in particular families. And as Alison said, that's something that I and my group have spent a lot of time. So I've spent a lot of my career sort of focusing on that. There's oh gosh, there's all sorts of sources, of insight about what happens to families. I mean, I found it particularly interesting to look at biographies of quite well-known people who've been in the situation of being family members. Two poets who had addiction problems. One was Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and I came across a really good biography that focused on his wife, who's one of those people who doesn't appear in most histories of the Romantic movement, but there she is, somebody who experienced Samuel Taylor Coleridge's addiction at first hand. Dylan Thomas, very well known, more modern, 20th century, wonderful poet, had a alcohol problem, died young of his alcohol problem. His wife, Courtline, or Catelyn, as he called her, Catelyn Thomas, is much less well known, but she was a writer and she wrote quite a lot, and she wrote a lot about what it was like to live with Dylan. And then Pete Doherty, the pop singer, who has had some issues with drugs. I think his wife wrote a very interesting book about not his wife, sorry, his mother. His mother wrote a very interesting book about what it was like to be his mother, and what she tried to do to help him with his drug problem. And Amy Winehouse, who sadly died, probably because of her drug problem. And there's a very interesting book that her father has written about what he tried to do to help and how he tried to cope as well. So there's a lot of interesting accounts around, and we've talked. My research group has talked over the years to many ordinary, not so famous people who've been in that situation of having an addiction problem in the family. We came up some years ago with what we call a model of what it's like to be in that situation in a family. It just has 4 bits to it. We call it the stress strain coping support model. So the basic building blocks of it are: one, that it is highly stressful, a highly stressful experience living with addiction in the family, comparable to other forms of stress. It's often a long-term form of stress. It can something that people can be living with for a long time, which makes it a particularly interesting example, and particularly unfortunate example of a long-term, often quite chronic family stress. And one of the peculiarities, I think, of living in close proximity to addiction is that you don't actually know how to understand it, and you don't really know quite how you should think of the person in the family who seems to be, because of their habit, causing difficulty in the family. You don't know whether they're bad, mad, or sad, to put it in a common phraseology. I mean, are they to blame for their behavior? Is it an illness? Is it an addiction that requires treatment? Should you be sympathetic? Should you supportive? Should you be standing up for yourself and your interests? Should you be tough about it? Should you be controlling about it? And that takes on to the second of our building blocks of the model, which is coping. So it's stressful. How should you cope with it? And how should you understand it? What should you actually do about it? Should you withdraw, as we talked about a little bit earlier on? Should you try and emotionally withdraw, detach, or should you stay engaged and fully trying to do something about it? The third building block, which I think is very important, is what we call support, and that is the idea that people really find it much easier to cope with a stress of this kind if they've got good support. I mean, it stands to reason. It's fairly obvious, isn't it? But in the case of families with an addiction problem, often people are lacking support for different reasons. Sometimes people may be lacking support because they don't feel it's something that they should be talking about to anyone else. They feel they may be breaking confidences, going outside the family with something that belongs inside the family. They may feel the stigma associated with addiction. They may feel they're to blame. This is often wives, sadly, have often suffered from that in the past. Will I be the one who's blamed for what's going wrong because I've not been a good enough wife? I've not been supportive enough. Or parents, of course, particularly feel that. Is it what I did wrong? Did I do something wrong as a parent? People may sometimes not get a very good response from other people if they talk about the addiction and what to do about it. People may get, well, you should leave him. Why don't you just leave him? And for many people, that just doesn't come anywhere near to even beginning to consider the seriousness of the problem. If you love someone but they're going through something, you can see they're going through something difficult and it's affecting you as well. The last thing you want to be told is, well, you should just leave the person. It's their responsibility. So for various reasons, people may not always get the support they need. So one of the things we do in our particular way of counseling families, as well as talking a lot about the stress, a lot about the way you can cope, we talk a lot about how you can get support. Who is there? In fact, we encourage counselors to draw a network diagram and get out a bit of paper and sort of draw all the people. There may be people you haven't seen for a while who you think could be very supportive. There's some people who have not got the attitude that you find very helpful. So you can cross them off as people who are a source of support and go for people you think are going to be particularly helpful. Should you get professional support, of course, is a big part of it. And then the fourth building block of our model of families is strain. And because stress leads to strain, what it actually does to the health of family members, and it can affect ordinary things like people's sleeping, people's eating, but can affect their physical health, and particularly, of course, it affects people's mental health. So it does affect clearly the anxiety and depression levels of family members if they're living with such a problem for any length of time. But it extends well beyond the family. A book I read some time ago, which was very interesting, was a book about. Do you remember him, Charles Kennedy, the Liberal Democrats leader? Was it Liberal Democrats then, or even going back some time? Was it even just the Liberals then? Anyway, he was leader of the Libs or the Lib Dems, and a lot of the book was about how the party dealt with the fact that it was becoming increasingly obvious that he had a serious drinking problem, what they did about it. And a lot of the things that one talks about in relation to families and family members will talk about were there in the party. There were people who wanted to go in and do something about it. There were people who wanted to take it more gently. There were people who avoided talking about it altogether. And what should they do? Should they send an old senior person down from somewhere else to have a quiet word with him? Should they confront him? Should a group of MPs confront him with what was going on? They didn't. Over a long period of time, they didn't deal with it very well. So the point I'm trying to make here really is that addiction is very disempowering. And we tend to think of it particularly focusing on the person who is actually seems to have the addiction to something, but it's actually disempowering for a range of people. In fact, numerically, probably the affected family members are the biggest group of people disempowered. So if we're going to do something about addiction, if we really want to campaign about addiction, make a noise about addiction, put pressure on government to do something relevant about addiction, almost the biggest stakeholder group is affected family members. But we're all affected in different ways. So we're all in this together. We're all disempowered. That was one thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say was about social factors, more social structural factors, systemic factors, societal factors that affect addiction and prevalence rates of addiction. And it's a complicated picture, but there's a lot to be said about that. I mean, one is that there are addiction problems that very clearly are related to social conditions. So illicit drug problems in many parts of the world, in many places, at many times, have clearly been related to deprivation levels and poverty levels, and they tend to cluster more in poorer and more deprived areas. So there's some forms of addiction where there's a lot of evidence that is very often the case. There are other examples where health gradients exist or appear over time. So smoking is a very interesting example. I don't know how long we're talking about. It might be talking about 100 years ago now, but there certainly were parts of the world where it was the relatively better off who were more engaged in tobacco smoking. It wasn't the harm that it did was not realized for many decades beyond after that, and it was considered to be a rather fashionable thing to do. That changed over time, and once it became clear that actually it was a serious health risk, actually one of the most serious health risks we have, for heaven's sake, tobacco smoking, then it became the gradient, a social class gradient started to emerge, whereby people who were relatively high up the social economic status hierarchy were better able to give up for various reasons. They were better able to give up smoking, and that has left quite a steep gradient now, where it is people in lower socioeconomic status groups, people in areas of deprivation, who are much more likely to have continued to smoke, and areas where people are more likely to take up smoking. Alcohol and gambling are quite interesting examples, because the evidence tends to be that actually, if you look at the sheer amount of money that people spend on alcohol and sheer amount of money they spend on gambling, actually there's a slight gradient going in the other direction. It's people who've got more money who actually spend more money on booze, and it's people who've got more money who actually spend more money on gambling. But when you look at indices of problems, the gradient reverses, and it becomes quite a strong gradient in the other direction. So if you look at rates of deaths from liver cirrhosis, for example, then that has a typical social class health gradient, with people who are lower socioeconomic status being at the more at risk of dying from liver cirrhosis. And similarly with gambling, people who have gambling problems are more likely to be in lower socioeconomic groups, more likely to be in relatively deprived areas of the country. And you can see in the case of gambling, you can see why that might be. I mean, if you look at it by income, then of course it's people on lower incomes who are spending much a higher proportion of their incomes on gambling, even though in absolute terms, because they're much poorer, they may be spending much less on gambling than richer people. They're spending a much higher proportion of their income on gambling, and as a consequence, it's much more of a serious problem. And then there's other aspects of this. We know that immigrant groups in many countries, and indigenous groups in Australia, Canada, and the United States and other places are at higher risk of addiction problems of various kinds. So that was the second thing I wanted to say. But the third area, I think, takes us on to what I think I was asked about in the question session earlier on, and that is, what about industry? And related to that, what are government doing? So this is much more now the sort of politics of how these things are being dealt with. Illicit and licit things obviously are in a somewhat different category. Illegal drugs, the trade in illegal drugs is devastating, devastating around the world. I mean, I spent a bit of time in Mexico at one stage in my career with people there who are working on addiction, and particularly how families were affected in Mexico. And since then, the numbers of violent deaths related to the illicit drug trade in Mexico is enormous. I mean, it's bigger than most wars that have gone on since the Second World War. I mean, this is huge numbers. I can't remember the exact numbers now, but it's in the hundreds of thousands now of people who've experienced violent death in Mexico in connection with the drug trade. It's enormous. But you don't have to go to Mexico to see this. There's a lot of talk now about country lines. And I regret to say one of the country lines is probably coming down from London down to where I live in Brighton. And I just recently realized that it's going on all around me. So there was the block of apartments next to where I live has had a number of incidents. The police have had to be involved where their entrance is being used by people for drug dealing. And just down the road from me, not many nights ago, there was a drug raid on a house just in the next door street to where I'm living. So you don't have to go to other parts of the world. It's going on. The effect of the illicit drug trade is enormous. And then, of course, the legal drug trade, alcohol, gambling, food was mentioned earlier on. This is often in the hands of enormous companies, often international companies, getting bigger often. I mean, the takeovers, certainly in the alcohol business, and the gambling has been a lot in the gambling business recently. Some of the big companies have been taken over by other companies. So there's a big amalgamation of companies. So they're absolutely enormous. And of course, they don't always say, they keep their old names. So you think that, I don't know. I forget exactly who's taken over who now. It happens so quickly. But these are enormous companies that wield a enormous influence on politicians and other people, and use that power to try and block changes that would be in the interests of health, in the interests of protecting people. And one of the subtle ways, or not so subtle, possibly, ways in which the addiction supply industries, if I can put it that way, exercise their power is by getting other people, governments particularly if they can, but getting all the rest of us to accept a particular way of thinking. In the discourse, I think is the word that one would use now in terms of social theory. They have a discourse or a set of discourses about the products that they're trying to sell to people. And I've particularly come across this because I've got a particular interest in gambling now, and there's so much going on that's interesting in the gambling field just now. But it's very much the same for alcohol, and I think it's very much the same for fast foods as well, sugar and so on. And the discourse consists of a number of different parts. A central element of the discourse is that the product itself is harmless. This is a harmless product. So, there may be a few people who suffer some consequences, but isn't that true of almost everything? But our product essentially is harmless, when actually, of course, exactly the opposite is true. I mean, it's it's always been the case that alcohol is a harmful drug. It is a drug. It is harmful. It's only not harmful if you take it very carefully, and you take it in small quantities, and you don't take it too often. And fortunately, some of our legislation over the years in alcohol has helped us do that. So all the measures of alcohol has helped us do that. The fact that spirits, being particularly strong forms of alcohol, are very expensive, got a very large rate of tax on them, enables us to, and the things we drink out of tend to be small. If you're served in a pub some spirits, it's going to be it's hopefully going to be in a small glass. But even that changes. I mean, I've noticed over the years the wine. Wine never used to be served in much more than 125 milliliters in any one, which is about a unit. That's gone up. 150 is now normal. A large glass is now 225 or 250, which is about a third of a bottle of wine. So I find myself often making a nuisance of myself in restaurants. Not that I go into restaurants now. It'd be nice. Wouldn't it be lovely to go in a restaurant? But when we did go into restaurants, I would make a bit of a nuisance of myself when people said, "Oh, do you want what size of wine?" I said, "Well, I want 125. Can you do me 125 milliliters?" When actually what they're offering is 150 or 250. And I said, "Well, 125." They said, "Well, I suppose I can split a 250 glass between you." I say, "Yes, please. That is a normal glass." So anyway, won't go on about that. But so where was I going? With that? I got excited about that. I've lost my track. Yes, it's the idea that it's harmless. And certainly in the case of gambling, one of the part of the discourse is that this is an ordinary leisure activity. So the gambling industry is very keen to promote the idea that all they're offering is a relatively harmless leisure activity, an entertainment just like any other. It's not how it's advertised. It's advertised as you are likely to win, of course, money from us, but when the truth of the matter is that you're likely to lose. But that's part of the discourse. It's not. So then part of the discourse is, of course, well, the prevalence is fairly low. So they will quote figures like the prevalence of problem gambling is 1/2%. 1/2%, they say. That means large bulk of us can gamble quite happily, but they don't call it gambling, of course. They call it having a flutter or a bet or gaming, and so they don't like to use the word gambling. But of course, in public health terms, 0.5% of the whole population is very large. I mean, in terms of viruses, if 0.5% of the population is getting ill with a virus, that the whole country can be brought to a standstill in order to deal with that. But when it's gambling, I don't know, 0.5%, it's nothing. But if you convert that into numbers, of course, it's somewhere between a third and half a million people who have what's considered to be a serious gambling problem. Part of the discourse is the right to choose. Doesn't everybody have a right to spend their money on things? Doesn't everybody have a right to choose? We're a free country. You don't want to stop people doing what they want to do. And then the final bit of it is personal responsibility. So the talk will often be the large bulk of people can use our product perfectly safely or responsibly, as if to say anybody who can't use our product properly is irresponsible, or there's something wrong with them they can't take. So the discourse is really important. And certainly in the case of gambling, not only has the government accepted that, and it's pretty much written into our existing legislation, which is the 2005 Gambling Act, which the government is currently reviewing, but it's also something which I think most people have accepted. They've accepted that, oh yes, gambling is normal. So the normalization of gambling is something that has gone on apace in recent years. I could go on. I could go on this angle quite a lot, because it is something that has been occupying me a lot in recent times. Part of what I'm concerned about as a academic sort of person is the bias on research. So if the accepted discourse is that this is an ordinary product, it's a harmless product essentially, and what is wrong, when things go wrong, we can look to individuals to try and understand why it's gone wrong, not to the way we promote the product or the way we talk about it or the legislation that we've been so keen to get put in place. And that runs through into the research that's funded. And there's a story about how the research is funded in gambling, which I won't go into, but basically the money for research in universities comes from the gambling industry. And at the moment, it comes from a voluntary levy. It's how much the gambling companies voluntarily give towards research and towards treatment and prevention every year. So it's a thoroughly corrupt system, basically. And the influence trickles through to the kind of research that's been done. So I've just seen a draft report that Public Health England are producing about the current state of research in Britain. And they've done a really good job about reviewing, all the stuff that's been written about, hundreds of papers written on the subject. And just to give you a little bit of a flavor, one of the popular areas for research recently, in recent years in gambling, has been what is called impulsivity. So this is the idea that maybe something that puts people at risk is a personality trait called impulsivity. And it turns out, I can't remember the exact numbers, but it turns out that there's over 150 papers in academic journals and elsewhere in the last few years looking at this personality characteristic of impulsivity. And you compare that with the number of papers that have been published on whether the way in which the gambling industry advertises and markets its products. It turns out that the figure is about somewhere in the region of 30. I forget the exact number, but it's minor compared to those academics who've been looking at impulsivity. And that is not unrelated to the influence of the gambling industry, the impact they've had on the way we all think of gambling in society, the way the government thinks about it. And government, to be fair, has realized there is a problem. And they've been told it's a big problem. They've been told they should do something about it. They've been told by a committee of the Lords that they should do something very significant about it. They've been told by an all-party parliamentary group that they should do something about it. The all-party parliamentary group, led by a Swansea MP called Carolyn Harris, who's very fired up about this issue. Her committee, this all-party, and it's not just Labour. She's a Labour MP. It's an all-party parliamentary group. Ian Duncan Smith, for example, is a very prominent member of it, who feels very strongly about gambling. They reckon that gambling is probably not something that should be advertised at all. It's not an appropriate product to be advertised. Well, that's interesting. And I can't see the government in their current review sort of saying, we should ban all advertising. But what I think a lot of people hope they might do is ban all the sponsorship and the advertising around football grounds and other sports grounds, because I'm interested in football. I watch a match of the day at the weekend. The grounds are just full of gambling adverts before the match, after the match, surrounding the match, on the players' shirts, everywhere. It's a massive advertising boost for the gambling industry. So those various things, families, all of us involved, societal factors, very important. The discourses we understand about these things, very, very important. Role of government, very important. It's a big issue. It's not just an individual issue. It's not just a personal issue, But the personal people with addiction problems are the ones who carry most of the stigma. They're the ones who carry most of the stress. They're the ones who carry most of the power, disempowering and demoralizing effects of addiction. But this is something that affects us all. So thank you. I look forward to some more questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Jim. Again, you've covered so much ground, and I can say from Quad's point of view, we really share your concerns about the normalisation agenda, and also, the intention, particularly of the industry, to identify as an individual problem, that most people can gamble or drink perfectly sensibly. When the fun stops, stop. Please drink responsibly. And if you have got a problem, then it's effectively down to you and something that's wrong in your makeup. And I think that is an issue that we always argue very strenuously about, and I know you do when we're responding to government consultations. We have had a couple of questions, and I'm sure there'll be more coming through. There's one that I wanted to ask just briefly, going back to what you were saying about family. And when we talk about the impact on families, we often are almost subconsciously talking about the adults in the family, the parents and the partners. But we do know that it has a tremendous impact on children. And particularly those children who are too young to process and perhaps articulate what their experiences are. Do you have anything to say in relation to the impact on children?
Well, I think just to agree absolutely with what you say. I think children are particularly affected. I mean, if you think of the disempowerment sort of concept, which I use a lot. I mean, adults can be very disempowered in the family, but of course, children are the ones who necessarily are. It's why they need looking after. It's why they need nurturing, because they're young and they don't have the power that hopefully most of us as adults acquire, and the ability to stand up for ourselves later on. So children are right at the receiving end of this, and I think in some ways it's the effect on children which, when it comes to government listening, and I get very frustrated because this is something over the years I've been concerned about, as you know, and the groups I work with are, you are, but the effects on families of addiction, I think, is still something which is kind of secondary. It's not seen as being such a major problem as it should, and I think the fact that it affects children is surely, one of our levers. If we need levers, to get government to listen, to get people to listen to how big a problem addiction is, the fact that it's affecting children is really the big one, isn't it?
It is. Let me turn to some questions that we've received from people who are listening in. There's one here from Mark Bittle. Hello, Mark. The war on drugs has failed. Is it time to change tack as per Portugal?
Right. Yes, I thought Alison warned me this kind of question might be coming, and I know it's something Quad has looked at, and I know, and opinions differ, I think, everywhere on this particular issue, and it's a complicated issue, isn't it? A really, really complicated issue. I think most people do look to Portugal rather favourably. I saw all the things that I've heard from people, and again, it's not something that the decriminalization or legalization of drugs is not something that I've looked at very closely myself, but from what I have heard, people generally think Portugal is doing rather well. One of the things that's often said about decriminalization of drugs is, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, decriminalization could mean any one of a variety of things. It could mean, we just treat them like any other product. So the same people who market alcohol now could market the drugs that we consider to be illicit now, or it could be that they're made much more easily available via medical practitioners. So it requires, It requires that it's medically prescribed to do things, or it could mean something different. It could mean something, I don't know, like, I mean, how we deal with prostitution in Britain is an interesting in-between case. I mean, it is illegal, I think, but in mostly, but the authorities tend to tolerate it in certain confined areas of major cities. Beyond that, I don't know details, but there are in between cases. I get the impression Portugal has dealt with it rather well, that you're, for relatively small quantities that appear to be for your own consumption, and they're in your own possession and your own consumption, you're not treated as someone who's potentially broken a law, but you may well be helped towards referral to somewhere where you might be able to get help if you need help for your drug problem. That's about all I know. That's a very general picture I've got. I don't know any more details, but I mean, I think what that illustrates, if anything like that is the case, I think what it illustrates is that any solution to drugs is going to be some sort of in-between solution. It's not going to be a complete commercialization. And heaven forbid, I mean, the commercialization of gambling, isn't a good advert really for the full commercialization of drugs, I would say. So it depends what you mean. But I think I have to say, I think over the years I've moved, more sympathetically towards a position of, it's, enough is enough, really. It's doing enough. The illicit, the illegal nature of the drug, and the forcing people who supply drugs and use them to go through criminal channels to do all that is probably more unhelpful than helpful, I think, is probably my position now.
Thanks very much, Jim. And I'm sure that's a question and a subject that we'll return to in future events. There's a lot of questions coming through, so forgive me if I'm looking a bit dazzled here. Question here from Dorothy Jerome. Any thoughts about young people's use of social media and industry response re taxation issues and control of content? So this is a different form of addiction in a way, but one that's becoming very prevalent, particularly during the lockdowns.
Yes. Another area I don't know an awful lot about, I have to say. Partly my age, I guess, will be responsible for that. I do see my grandson spending an awful lot of time, playing games. I also know that in the gambling area, there's a lot of discussion about gambling-like activities, which are part of games. So they just look like games, but actually, if you have to play something that looks rather like roulette in order to get something that is useful to you in pursuing the game, whether it be a weapon, because a lot of the games, unfortunately, are sort of weaponized games. If it's a weapon, or if it's a farm game, whether it's a farm animal or something, or a bit of land you can add, whatever it is, that's looking like gambling. And also the extraordinarily complicated links between companies that sell and market games, those that sell gambling, those that are gambling affiliates who put people in touch with gambling. So the connections which are totally beyond me. I mean, I'm coping with Zoom is about as much as I can do on the technical side, but the connections now are so many and so quick, and young people are so well versed in doing those things and forming the links, that I think it's quite clear that the whole the whole sort of internet environment is is affecting addiction. I mean, Mark Griffiths, who's somebody who's done a lot of work in Britain over the years in addiction. He's very interested in gaming addiction, and one of his points is that the internet, or the online, whatever general term you want to use, has actually altered addiction in all sorts of ways. It's altered the way in which potentially addictive things are sold, the way they can be accessed. I mean, it's revolutionized gambling, of course, because instead of gambling being something where you have to go somewhere to do it, and something is relatively slow, and there's only 6 races an afternoon at wherever the racing is going on. It's now 24 hours. It's on your phone. It's it's wherever you are 24 hours a day. So, but generally, I know Mark says, he makes a very good point, I think, when he says that actually the growth of the internet and online has altered the world of addiction generally.
Interesting. And one that, and that's an issue I think that will expand and will require a lot more research to thoroughly understand that as we go down over the next few years. Thank you very much, Jim. Gillian Wood has asked a question which goes onto your discussion about the discourse, and I found it very interesting what you were talking about, the bias of research. And he was saying, is a discourse the same in Wales and Scotland and other European countries?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it probably is. I think those discourses are fairly general. They're interesting. I mean, gambling again. I keep on going on about gambling because it's very much uppermost in my mind these days. But the interesting thing about gambling around Europe is actually how different it's been. I mean, there are countries where casinos have been the thing. I mean, France, I think, is always been quite relatively big on casinos. There are parts of Europe where you, until fairly recently anyway, you couldn't play a gambling machine in public. I mean, there might be gambling machines in casinos, but there aren't in public. And the way we've got used to being surrounded by gambling machines in the high street, in amusement arcades, in betting shops, in pubs, everywhere. But that's not the same everywhere. Spain has just brought in a new law which means gambling can only be advertised between, I think it's 1 o'clock and 5 o'clock in the night. It can't be advertised at any other time. I think I'm right on that. Yeah, so it's things around Europe vary a lot, but I think the discourse is pretty much the same, and that's because industry is so international. So the international companies are international. Of course, the alcohol companies are international. So I think the discourse is pretty much the same. It's obviously going to be different in some countries where they have historically had a very different attitude towards alcohol and gambling. I mean, Muslim countries particularly, it's going to be, the public discourse is going to be very different. In fact, there may be, the public discourse may be much more negative about it than the private discourse, which may be a bit more like drugs, illicit drugs in the West. I don't know.
And what they've done in Australia and New Zealand has been at the forefront, really, of starting to change public attitudes through a public health approach to addiction. Which again is another huge subject, and I really wish that we could have far more time this morning, Jim. We have had more questions through. I will just apologise to all of you who posted questions that we haven't had time to answer this morning, but do be reassured I'm going to do my very best to cover those, both in quadrant and potentially to return to some of those issues in future events. We are planning to run some further webinars and also smaller group meetings over the coming year. Thank you once again, Jim. That was really interesting and very stimulating in terms of all the different issues that you've mentioned, the writers and the books that you've recommended. I'm sure that will give us good food for thought after today. It's always good to see you, and thanks for being such a good friend to Quad. We always appreciate it when you're engaged with us. Just a few comments in closing, if I can. Obviously, It was a huge disappointment that we had to cancel our Woodbrook conference in July last year for obvious reasons. And I know for some of you, this webinar digital experience isn't ideal, but I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope that you will give us some honest feedback. After the event, you'll be sent an automatic feedback form to complete. I've tried to keep the questions to a minimum, but any feedback that you can give us, it's anonymous, so you can be really honest, but we will learn from the comments that you give us, and it will give us a sense of what you'd most like us to do in future events during the year. So I hope as many as possible of you will complete that after today. Please let friends know if you've enjoyed it and they haven't been able to attend. And also that because we've recorded it this morning, I hope my technological skills will stretch to uploading this onto the website over the next week or two. So keep an eye on that. And we will be covering this event in Quadrant next time, which is due out in March. As you may know, Quad doesn't receive any external funding. We are enormously grateful for the very generous donations and legacies that we receive from individuals and from local and area meetings. So I hope you'll consider perhaps running an appeal for Quad if you can in your local meeting, and perhaps to make a donation after today if you feel moved to. We would be very grateful, as I say. So I hope that you enjoy the rest of your weekend. I hope that you all keep well. I'd like to say it's been lovely to see you. I hope it will be possible to see as many as possible of you face to face at a time in the future. But until then, I bid you adieu, and thanks once again to Jim. Thank you.